Hi guys, we're going to make a start now.
Hello.
This is my colleague Susan Steed, who's a researcher in our finance and business team. She actually wrote the 2nd and the 11th briefing, but she's very kindly offered to talk us through number 1 as well. If other people join, you won't hear any kind of interruption or anything. They'll just appear in the chat box. So please feel free to use that for any questions during the presentation, or that's the way you'll be able to ask us questions at the end. This is going to be recorded, so again, if people miss any of it, they can listen to it again at a later date, and the same for some of your colleagues who are out enjoying the sun rather than watching us in the NEF spaceship doing this presentation. So if we get started now, remember, use the chat box if there's anything that you want clarified. There might be some definitions or some vocabulary that you're not quite sure of. Of course, feel free to ask us that during the presentation. Other than that, yeah, I hope you'll enjoy it, and we're going to go through the 1st and 2nd of the case studies as well, which give the briefings a marine and fisheries context. So hopefully you'll find that useful, and of course you can read them as well in your own time. I hope that some of you would have done that already. So,
Great, okay, let's get started. Good. So as Kristen said, today we're going to be summarising the first of the 2 briefings. We're going to spend most time doing the 2nd briefing and trying to give an overview of how economics is actually used in practice, which we think will be most useful of how you probably interact with economics on a day-to-day basis. To some extent, today is a sort of big whistle-stop tour of economics, because a lot of the things we'll introduce today will be picked up in more detail in later briefings, so we'll try and flag that up when things will be revisited in a later briefing. But let's get started straight away. So first of all, what is economics? If you look at a textbook, it will give you a definition that economics is about the study of scarcity and choice, or something quite abstract. But in practice, economics is really about, to be honest, everything. So from what people eat, why people interact, how people interact with other people, how people get jobs or who works, through to really big questions about why some countries have much higher death rates, to everything really. I mean, people that tend to be economists or that call themselves economists or have studied economics tend to more have a particular way of looking at these issues. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, in the difference between people that will call themselves microeconomists or macroeconomists. Before we go on with that, we just wanted to sort of interject and say a few really big issues in economics at the moment, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. The first thing is the financial crisis. As we all know, we've had the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, and most professional economists fail to see this coming, which poses some really big questions about the way economists make models, or the things that they think are important in predicting the future. Secondly, economists tend to dismiss the idea of environmental limits. So a lot of economic theories and ideas kind of take place quite outside of the idea of the Earth having natural limits. As Herman Daly describes it, economic models are often considered totally separate from the environment, but whereas in fact the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the reverse. Okay, and the third challenge is around economic inequality. This is another issue that economists tend to have not given enough thought to. So issues about how resources are distributed and the growing inequality both within countries and between countries of the world poses some really serious challenges, both to the stability of markets and also political stability. So we're going to move on to just quickly looking at different types of economics. If you meet people that are professional or academic economists, they tend to see themselves as either theoretical economists or empirical economists, and to be either micro or macro. So there are a few examples on the slide. It's probably easier to understand what empirical economists do, because they use data to come up with theories about why things happen or why some things cause other things. So for example, in macroeconomics, people that have received quite a lot of attention recently are Reinhardt and Rogoff, who've basically been looking at the relationship between debt and economic growth. and they have a quite widely used relationship that the higher a country's debt, the poorer their economic growth was. And this relationship was used to justify austerity programs around the world. Unfortunately for them, a PhD student asked to use their data and found that they'd actually missed out a whole chunk of countries in their Excel formulas, which meant the relationship they'd actually calculated broke down in the extreme cases. So it was a bit of a challenge for them. But the theory here is that that's what they're doing. They're using data from countries to try and look for relationships. Theoretical models don't tend to use data, and these are the ones that often have the most criticism from outsiders in the way that economists use these sorts of theories, and one of the reasons why people think they didn't predict the financial crisis. There are some very good theoretical economists, and Paul Krugman, who is now very well-known blogger and journalist, has also won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he kind of highlighted one of the problems with academic theory in a paper he wrote, which was called The Theory of Interstellar Trade. And this talked about the different trading between different planets in the solar system. The actual subject, he described it, was quite ridiculous, but the way he did the equations, the way he did the analysis was very rigorous. So he said that this was quite the opposite to most economics. You take a very serious subject, but do very ridiculous analysis of that subject. And that's how one of the things that he thought was a real problem, the way that academic economists do theory. Before we move on, I'll just say another type of economist you might meet, a kind of behavioral economists, who tend to be quite different in that often study psychology or marketing, and they tend to use experiments in the way that they do practice. Right, I think I'm going to move on to the next slide. No. Okay. So what I just talked about is all very well in terms of how academic or professional economists define themselves, but in the real world I think there are lots of other types of economists. One of these I'll describe as somebody like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. He actually has never studied economics, but he has probably the most senior economics position in the UK. And I think that's something to learn here, is that he's actually imposing his political ideas, but giving them a justification in economics. And there's a question as to where the line between those two things are. So I think there's a sort of question come up in the chat window just about this point. The second type of economist I think you need to be careful of is people who might well be academic economists, but have taken on work or jobs where they're quite conflicted by the people that pay their wages. I think a good example here is someone called Frederick Mishkin, who's had various roles at the Federal Reserve in the US. He did a piece of work which was commissioned to do, in fact paid over $100,000 to do, by the Icelandic Chambers of Commerce. This was back in 2006 when there was quite a lot of questions about what was really going on in Icelandic banks, and a lot of people were quite worried about this. So he was commissioned to write this report to look into what was really happening. And he had a look and found everything to be fine. In fact, his report was called Financial Stability of Iceland. The problem was 2 years later, we had the banking crisis. Many of the problems beginning, Iceland being one of the worst affected countries. So there's a question as to why he didn't find any of those things out in his report. And an even bigger question is why he decided to change the title of the report on his CV to Financial Instability of Iceland. If you have time, it's a very good film. The film where this is kind of referenced is called Inside Job, and there's a very good interview with Matt Damon interviewing this guy and asking him just what went on with that report. So finally, we're going to move on to more practical economics in practice in a minute, but just our last slide on what economics is also what economists actually do. So you might have heard of the term econometrics. This is basically the posh kind of way of saying statistics that economists use. And I'm doing a PhD in economics, and if you do a PhD or if you do a master's or study economics at university, you'll be quite familiar with some of the tools that economists tend to use. However, what I think is quite important is that most economists worry most about trying to understand causal links between different variables. So why is education important? What things about it make things better for people or worse for people? And trying to understand those really understand what causes what. And it's really, really difficult to do that. However, in practice and in the field, the sort of economics you normally meet is much more things like cost-benefit analysis, or putting numbers on things or financial values on things, which isn't necessarily the same thing as people that would consider themselves economists at universities would use. So we're going to kind of see this distinction later in the presentation, and in fact we're going to focus really on economics in the wild, which is cost-benefit analysis.
Thanks, Susie. So throughout these presentations and briefings, you can obviously refer back to them. They're attached to the invites and things like that. And the case studies, rather than reading them out to you, we're going to cherry pick some of the key points and also draw in some other information that will make it kind of relevant to your job. The case study for the first one was about integrated coastal zone management. And the idea of this was just to show what a diversity of economic analysis and tools are used when dealing with integrated coastal zone management. It came from some work that was conducted by a guy called James Spurgeon, who does quite a lot of this kind of work. Examples would be, for financial analysis, for example, would be prices actually paid in markets. So if you go out on a seal watching tour, you've paid a certain amount of money to do it, and that money could be added up for all the people on the boat for every day of the year that they go out, and give you an indication as to what financially that sort of seal business is worth. We have economic impact analysis. Obviously, most of you will be very familiar with impact assessments, for example, but looking at how particular decisions might impact on people's jobs or on their income or on their spending. You can look at socioeconomic issues, which brings in the whole element of well-being. So, for example, at Plymouth University, they're doing some work on indicators for marine protected areas. So what would happen for people's well-being, or for house prices, or for people's health if they live near a protected area, for example. And you also have economic welfare analysis, which is about helping the government to decide how to use the scarce resource, in this case often money, to maximize benefits to society. And then finally, environmental economics, which is this fundamental link between the economy and the environment, which will be dealt with in the next session with Olivier. In terms of the values used, obviously, as I said, for financial values, you obviously get prices. The typical tools would be profit and loss, or the budget for a particular business. For the economic impact, it would be looking at expenditure or jobs, so that's just a number, and the typical tools would be input and output models. So, for example, one of my colleagues here is working on an input-output model for fisheries at the moment, which would tell you if you changed the management of fisheries in this way, i.e. brought in regulations or something, what would actually happen to the number of fishermen? Or if the price of fuel doubled, what would happen to the, what would happen to the fishing industry? Then you could look at socioeconomics. Again, that's more complicated metrics, but also something that we do a lot of here at NEF, to do with well-being and people's livelihoods. And the typical tools, again, as I mentioned, would be indicators like the work that's going on in Plymouth. And finally, the economic welfare analysis would be things like consumer surplus. So that's more the direction of asking people, how much do you value your local marine park, or how much do you value your local protected area? And the typical tools are cost-benefit analysis, because that enables you to get a financial proxy or a financial value, which you can then put into what's essentially a mathematical calculation.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the main section of today, which is how economics is used in decision-making. And when we say decision-making, we typically are meaning when governments decide to intervene or do something. This could mean imposing new taxation, regulating something, or buying something like healthcare, or doing something like that. We're going to, on the one hand, try and look at how it's supposed to be used, so have a look at what the guidance the Treasury gives before making any intervention. But from that, we think there are two problems. First, there are some problems with the actual theory they're using, and secondly, there are problems with the way these theories are implemented, or in practice are often even worse than the ideas that are set out in the Green Book. So, starting right at the beginning, there's a main sort of assumption within economics that the market is generally the best way to do things. So this is an idea going all the way back to Adam Smith. It's this idea that if you leave people who are going to buy and sell a product, they'll negotiate and come up with a price, and that's the best thing you can do. So if you've got somebody that's going to, say, make something like trainers, the best thing you can do is leave them to it, let them meet people that will buy the trainers, and in this interaction you'll get the people that want trainers having them at the price they want to pay for them. So this is the sort of ideal. In practice there are lots of problems with this. The two problems that the Treasury see as reasons for intervening in markets are firstly that there might be a market failure. So this is called a problem of efficiency. And we're actually going to talk about this, there'll be in more detail in one of the later briefings. But just to give a few examples, the trainer manufacturer might be polluting a lot from the factories where they make the trainers, which has an externality on other people that might live in the area and the broader environment. There might be other externalities, like it might be the case that, that lots of people can't afford to buy the trainers at the price, and we might decide that as a society that has a negative externality. So, for example, if children can't get to school because they can't walk, they haven't got any shoes, the government might decide actually we want to intervene in the market and provide shoes for free. That's not what happens, but it's just an example of another market failure. The second problem might be about distribution, so the problem of equity. So here the problem is not about how things are distributed in the way the market works, but the problem that markets are generally only reallocate resources. So if you have a starting position where somebody has many more resources than other people, the market will generally do no better than amplifying those inequalities. So you might decide we want to intervene and do something about this and change the underlying distribution. So they're the two reasons that the Treasury gives.
It's probably worth noting as well for people that don't know that the Green Book is a Treasury document which sort of provides an outline of how to approach this kind of economic analysis and gives guidance on what kind of discount rates and other things to use. So it's a kind of advisory document, and there's other ones, there's the Magenta Book and other ones which deal with, well, I think the Green Book is environmental.
Green Book is basically everything that anyone buys. It's just, I don't know what it's called, I don't know why it's green, but it has loads of different colours. They're running out of colours, that's why they've got the Magenta Book. But yeah.
But those are all available, and you can read through them. They're often referenced in the briefings, of course, as well.
So just following on from this idea that we have two reasons for intervening: efficiency, market failures, versus equity, distribution. You find it quite rare for economists to get too involved in equitable discussions about distribution. And I think there's quite a good quote on the screen here from Julian Legrand, who is by no means a particularly radical economist. But he says that many economists claim that questions of equity are outside of their professional competence. They prefer to stick to the allegedly value-free efficiency condition. And the challenge with this is that efficiency only alleges to be value-free. If you completely ignore equity or ignore how resources are distributed, then you're effectively making a value judgment to ignore it and to accept the existing distribution of resources. So the point to take away here is that efficiency isn't actually value-free. And I think that's something that's quite useful to remember, because you'll see, it's very, very common for people to talk about efficiency as if it's something sort of neutral, objective, and kind of inevitable, when really there are all sorts of value judgments within it, which we're going to look at in a bit more detail in this talk. Right, so moving on, once the government has made the decision that they want to make an intervention, then in theory what they're supposed to do is follow this thing called the ROMEF cycle, which you can see on the screen. So the theory goes that you've decided that there's been noted that, for example, the trainer company is polluting the atmosphere around where the factory is, needs to do something about it. What are you going to do? So there are various options. So the government could decide to tax, for example, the company. They could decide to impose regulation, which stipulates what they can and can't do. They might decide to buy some other service, like some kind of cleaning service, or commission that. There's all sorts of things they might be able to do. You have to have some way of deciding what the best option is, which is a very difficult thing to do. And then once you've decided, you have to have some way of monitoring whether it actually works. And then in theory, you use this evaluation to feed back into future decisions about future policy. However, in practice, what often seems to happen is that we get really hung up on the appraisal, a particular part of the appraisal phase. So we often might see a particular policy or idea gaining some political momentum, kind of divorced from a rationale or objectives to why we were going to do it in the first place. So at NEF we just produced a report on high speed 2. We think this is quite a good example of this. So people decided they thought it would be a good idea to have a high speed rail line. They then decided that a way to sell this or to talk about this was to describe it as being something that would reduce the north-south divide in England. But it's really questionable whether that particular idea, high speed 2, meets those objectives. And if you want to meet those objectives, there are a range of other things you could do which might better meet them. And I think this is what we really want to highlight and talk about in much more detail, is how these kind of appraisals, often cost-benefit analyses, get so much momentum behind them and are often seen as the way that decisions are made, even if really they're being used to justify an existing decision.
So this kind of links into the case study, which we're going to deal with simultaneously. The case study really focused on some work that FTech did, which is a consultancy that does a lot of work for DEFRA in all things environmental. So the case study is really about the Marine and Coastal Access Act and some of the issues that were identified in that by FTech. But I'm also going to bring in some examples from this very recent impact assessment for the Marine Conservation Zone, or the Marine Conservation Zones around the UK. And all of the subsequent slides are from DEFRA websites or from DEFRA documents, and it's just to sort of give you a point about the kind of the reason for doing the impact assessment in this case is to, as you can see on the screen, find out how and to what extent the recommended marine conservation zones may impact on stakeholders, and also what the estimated economic, environmental and social costs and benefits of the marine conservation zones would be. Of course, there you can see that in theory, again, economic, environmental and social, but as very many of you have identified throughout this process, it does tend to focus very much on the financial. And the idea of these impact assessments is really just to look at the impact of designating these protected areas on different sectors, so on maybe the fishing industry, or on the renewables industry, or on the aggregates industry, or on the tourism industry, and look at each of these sites one by one, and then add up that cumulative impact and basically decide on, you know, what the best course of action is, how government money should be spent, or taxpayers' money should be spent. The narrative in this impact assessment, which I'm sure you'll all have read with great joy, just states that a combined area of nearly 40,000 kilometres will be protected by designation. It will cover over 1,000 features, including habitats and species, which will be conserved. This will likely result in an increase in final ecosystem services, such as an increase in provisioning, regulating and cultural services, etc., etc., which basically means there'll be more fish, there'll be more marine tourism, there'll be more you know, other benefits like carbon capture from some of these marine habitats. And it also explicitly makes the point that many people will gain satisfaction just from knowing that these areas of the sea are going to be conserved for future generations. So that's that's a narrative in there, which is obviously something we all read and agreed with, and that's probably most of our motivation for working in marine conservation in the first place. And then we look at the actual options. So this sheet is just basically what the second and third pages of impact assessments look like, which give you some quite important information. It gives you the time period at the very top, which says the time period is 20 years. These sheets also give you the discount rate in another box, which is something that we'll deal with separately, so we won't dwell on that too much this time because it does need quite a lot of discussion. It brings up the idea of net present value, and it also presents two policy options. In the case of policy option 1, it was the government is going to designate 127 marine conservation zones, which is obviously what most NGO staff were hoping for, and option 2 was we'll only designate 31 of these 127 sites. For some of you this is probably far too familiar, and for others of you it might be the first time you've ever heard about it, so please again use the chat box if you have any questions or comments about it. So those are the options that are presented. Of course, there's particular issues which you'll have read about in the briefing. There's 6 main issues with them, and Susie's going to talk about them in their widest sense, often quite an ethical consideration, and then I'm going to give some examples from the impact assessment that I just presented to you. Great.
Okay, so the first challenge is one that I'm sure you've all sort of thought about before, is this problem with pricing things. To do a cost-benefit analysis, you have to try and take all the costs and benefits into account by giving them a financial value or proxy. So the theory of this is it's not actually giving them a price, you're using pounds as a proxy. But this has got a number of challenges. And the first one I really want to highlight here is the sort of more the philosophical and ethical problem with doing this. We'll go on to some of the practical problems in a bit later. I mean, the rationale for doing this and the good thing about doing this is it does get things, it can mean things that don't have a value up onto the balance sheet. They might get more notice. That's the argument for doing them. But the problem is, it means that we talk about them in a particular way. And there's a question of whether putting a price on things is the best way to think about things, and is the best way to make the case or the argument. And leading on from this, it also kind of assumes that things can be traded off against each other. So it sort of assumes that anything that then takes this pound sign proxy can be taken, you can actually trade them off, when there might be some things that actually there might be limited resources, or they might be non-renewable resources that really you can't look at them as being trade-offable against other things. So I think Chris has got some good examples of the challenges of.
Yeah, well, I've got some slides. This will again be very familiar to you. I mean, obviously that was taken from my bedroom this morning overlooking the beautiful British Columbia. But I mean, it kind of exemplifies it perfectly. I mean, what is the value of nature in that sense? Is it only, you know, does it have to be something that wildlife tourists will pay to see? I mean, are those orcas only valuable because people will go to British Columbia and go out and spend $100 a day to go out and see the orcas? And does the sum of all of those people being willing to pay for it mean that that's the final value of an orca? Of course, that's a big issue. We're going to go through that in detail in the next presentation next week. But I also wanted to highlight the fact that there's other reasons for protecting, obviously, the marine environment. You can see there a picture of a sunset coral. I mean, is the only way to determine the value of a sunset coral to figure out how many divers go to Lundy to take part in dives to go and see them, and then, you know, divide that up? I mean, there's far more to be said about nature than just its kind of financial value, and that's something I know that most of you are dealing with on a pretty much daily basis.
Great. So the second main challenge we see with doing sort of cost-benefit analysis is the role of equity we've already mentioned. So if you do look in the Green Book, the Treasury does have clear guidance that any project should consider the distributional consequences, that you should consider how it affects poorer income groups, etc. But in practice, it's quite rare to see it done well. So an example of this is we did some work looking at the decision to, or the proposal to build the third runway at Heathrow, and we found that the Department for Transport's analysis had focused mostly on benefits or perceived benefits to businesses from greater business travel and the benefits to the UK economy in terms of tourism. They kind of omitted or not valued enough things like the cost to people that live around the area, including a whole village that would have to be relocated. So there's a question about really who we value more in the way they've done that cost-benefit analysis. And our second little picture here of someone trying to shout is that what seems to really happen is people that shout louder are considered more in these sort of analysis, and people that don't have a voice, who might be, for example, future generations, might be the environment, aren't considered as much, and this is a real challenge.
It's an excellent example. I mean, for the second point, first of all, I know a lot of the people that I can see have logged into this were actually involved in the regional stakeholder groups for the Marine Conservation Zone work, and I'm sure all of you can think of a time where particular individuals would get up, talk loudly and very passionately about, you know, either for or against. It doesn't really matter, but it really boils down to the fact that it's not necessarily an equal share and everybody has an equal voice. It does tend to work on the basis that those people that kind of kick up the most are going to get listened to. And another good example is about the distribution, for example. If Natural England or government conservation advisors are meeting representatives of the fishing industry, if they're meeting representatives of the kind of really big multinational super trawler side of the fishing industry, when really most of the impact is going to be felt by small scale coastal fishermen, then again it's kind of a situation whereby they're not really looking at the distribution, the highest costs are often likely to be paid by people that aren't really asked in the same amount of detail. So, question there.
Might come back to that one.
All right, that's okay. Yeah, there's whoever put in that last question, that will get dealt with afterwards. So I wanted to bring your attention to one more aspect, specifically from the impact assessment from marine conservation zones, and that was this bit of text here you can see next to the arrow. This is from DEFRA's document which explains the MCZ selection process and ultimately explains why we've only got 31 out of 127 going through. Caveat: if there is a clear indication that there might be high non-quantified costs, including on non-UK fleets, then the site is classed as needs further consideration, i.e. included in later tranches. Now this is a really good example because first of all, there's a lot of uncertainty. What is a clear indication that there might be a high non-quantified cost, and also to non-UK fleets? So looking at the distribution here, what they're basically saying is, if this is going to affect big European fishing companies, then we'll probably have to drop it. Although that's not really what all of the processes that all of us have been involved in and that small-scale fishermen have been involved in, none of us have really fed into that. So it's essentially telling you that there's there's a stakeholder process going on, and then there's the big high-level kind of meetings where the kind of real decisions are made. And this is a perfect example of the difference between theory and practice.
Okay, the next point goes a little bit back to the discussion about pricing, but more the practicalities of it. So even if you accept that it is a good idea, or in this case it will be helpful to put proxies on costs and benefits, it's quite difficult to do it. So I've had quite a lot of experience of doing this, and it takes a really long time to find a good proxy. And often it's actually quite an arbitrary process of deciding what you're going to choose as a proxy. Now, not only is that time consuming, but it also means that you divert time and resources and discussion away from some of the really big issues about whether the thing that you're discussing will work, will meet the needs, or will actually make a difference in the longer term, to quite arcane, in some cases, costs about the particular amount a particular person values going to a particular park on a particular day. And I think you often lose the really big, or lose sight of the really big questions when you get too engrossed in discussion of costs. I'll hand it to Chris now.
Thanks. Drawing again from the same kind of case study, if you look at the assessment of costs, lots of these are also very, very uncertain, which kind of feeds into the next point. But here was just a list of 4 of the costs, those that arise from operators altering their operations to mitigate likely impacts. So that could be people not fishing in a particular area, it could be a wind farm not getting built, the increased costs that are likely to be incurred by operators, so that's if it becomes a protected area, how much money will they have to spend to do the assessment to make sure they meet the kind of environmental guidelines, cost of monitoring and enforcement, and the cost of verifying that the features within the sites are there and then monitoring them. I mean, all of these are actually very, very unclear and are very, very frequently overstated when it comes to these kind of assessments, which then obviously gives you a different ratio of costs versus benefits and can make things that, according to the narrative, are very, very important, can actually make them seem like a bad investment, which is why timelines and discount rates and things like that are important and will be dealt with separately. Okay, so our 4th of the 6 points is the problems of really assessing risk and uncertainty. So of course it's really difficult to do these things, and actually economic models don't have a particularly good way of assessing either of these challenges. I mean, I've heard the example before that when you do a cost-benefit analysis, it's like making a really, really delicate recipe for some French soup. You spend a really long time like chopping up the garlic and chopping up all the herbs and making sure you've got the exact quantities of these things and putting them all in, and then suddenly at the last minute you chuck in an elephant and expect it not to make a difference to how it tastes. So this is kind of the idea. There are these really big things that we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't really know even how to think about these things, but make the rest of the model that you spend a lot of time doing really seem rather pointless. It's an excellent example, and in the case study, you'll actually also see this was FTEC's own assessment for DEFRA. So this isn't our opinion. This is what went straight back to DEFRA. the assumptions in the impact assessment are that all of these relationships are linear. So it doesn't include feedback loops, it doesn't include all kinds of events that we know do occur in nature, massive variation in populations year by year, and all kinds of things that really don't just change in a linear, kind of slow, regular way. It also says specifically that there are numerous uncertainties around the cost, so that's not just us saying it, also around the valuation methods used, not just us saying it, and also when the expert judgment is used. And I think those three things really are pretty important to focus on. Most of the changes that we're likely to see are going to be fairly unpredictable, uncertain, and non-linear. And I think it's something really important to bear that in mind when you're going through these impact assessments, or even when you're discussing the validity of them to a large degree. Some of the main risks, obviously, in the marine environment are climate change. I mean, we don't really know what will happen to the movement of species in a massive amount of detail. We don't know what the impact on some habitats would be. We do know, for example, that as the ocean pH changes and becomes more acidic, that, for example, chalk reefs or shellfish or other things that fix calcium carbonate, obviously there will be changes there, but that's often not accounted for. And the same for fish stock collapses. I mean, the Grand Banks in Canada was a great example. It all went on and on and on until one day it just had to be closed. And that wasn't a slow linear process, it was a sudden crash. The same way with when people talk about the Gulf Stream potentially dying down or being redirected, these sort of things will have a sudden impact which isn't accounted for in the kind of in the framework of an impact assessment, at least. And also, I thought it was worth picking out this final quote about uncertainty from the document, which said that impacts on non-UK fisheries are assessed using qualitative information collected by JNCC, which is the Joint Nature Conservancy, from representatives of fisheries in those countries. Generally, impacts have not been assessed quantitatively because the necessary data were not available. So it's basically telling you that although they've made a lot of big decisions about the impact on the fishing industry, they don't really necessarily know very much at all, which I thought was interesting.
Okay. So one of our final points is just this idea of economic decisions being objective. So you've probably seen this image before, depending on how you're looking at it, depends what you might be seeing. But essentially, often in a report, you're presented with a figure or a decision which is presented as it's what the economics have said. Whereas if you end up, if it's cost-benefit analysis, if you end up looking at the analysis, you'll see that figure has been made up of tens, maybe hundreds of individual subjective decisions by the modeler to get those final numbers. I mean, a couple of other examples of this, which we'll come back to in later briefings, is the idea of measuring economic growth. And you know, the decision to measure GDP is a political decision. You know, after that particular way of measuring GDP was invented by Kuznets in the 30s, it's what everybody seems to have used. We don't need to use that. We decided to use that. And the second thing that we'll definitely come back to in later briefings is the idea of the discount rate. So this is effectively a decision that we discount benefits in the future more than if they happened today or tomorrow. And there's a particular rate that the Treasury recommends that people use, which if you use that rate, you discount the future by 3.5%. You could use a much lower rate, which the Stern Review did, or you could use a higher one, and you'll get very different answers. So that the point here really is it's a decision to use that rate. It's not something that's natural. It's not a natural law or a natural relationship.
Excellent. So to draw that back again to the impact assessment for the marine conservation zones, the standard time horizon of 20 years and 3.5% discount rate was used. Again, as Susie said, it's a value-based decision, so all of the attention to detail for trying to quantify all of the other things would change so drastically if that was even dropped to 1.5% or if the time horizon was up to 50 years. That, you know, it's really, really important to bear that in mind. And the final kind of word on that is also that just coming up with a ratio of benefits to costs as your final answer, but that itself being determined by the kind of subjective decisions that you make to begin with is in my opinion quite a skewed way to go about it. Is there another?
Okay.
Yeah, so the final conclusion was that the study suggests that a network of marine conservation zones would have a positive benefit to cost ratio between 6.7 and 38.9. And if you compare that to the narrative, which is supposedly the reason for doing all of this, I think you'll see that those are actually two very, very different kind of approaches.
Okay, so our sort of our final point for this session is kind of adding up some things we've already said, is that in total, it seems that sometimes economic arguments, I think, contribute to a lack of democracy. So it's sometimes the case that arguments are presented as something natural or inevitable. So if you hear current arguments around austerity, it sounds like it's something that has to happen, or it's something the economy has decided or the markets have decided, when really it's a decision, it's a political decision. And I think that's the same often with cost-benefit analysis. It kind of very much shuts down other types of argument or other types of value-based argument that might be more effective or more appropriate. I think Chris has got a good example of this.
Yeah, I was going to draw your attention to some work that Greenpeace produced must have been about 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago. And I want you to bear in mind the caveat that I read out before from the decision-making process. If there is a clear indication that there might be high non-quantified costs, including on non-UK fleets, then the site is classed as needs further consideration. So this is basically why some of the sites are dropped. But the reason we're bringing this to your attention is that actually the main representative of fishing organisations that the government meets to discuss these things and discuss what the impact on the fishing industry will be is the NFFO, the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. And Greenpeace did some really excellent work here, which basically showed that, first of all, the majority of the producer organisations that are in this organisation are actually not even English. They're Dutch, Icelandic and Spanish. It also showed that lots of the fishing associations that the NFFO claim to represent don't actually exist or haven't been members, or haven't been members for a vast number of years. So what it basically means, this is a really good example of a lack of democracy. The government can say, for all intents and purposes, that they have consulted with the fishing industry, but they've really only heard the voices of a very powerful lobbying group which represents pan-European fishing interest and is not really the kind of 77% of people that work in fishing in the UK who are actually working at a very, very much smaller scale. So this is a really good example of how democracy could be slightly slightly ignored using this kind of approach. But that report's available online, obviously, as well.
So, just to sort of summarise, then we'll answer some of the questions that are popping up. I suppose what we hope to do in this session is to kind of highlight some of the problems with economics as it's often used in cost-benefit analysis. And I'm sure a lot of you've already got experience with these sort of reports, but we're just sort of hoping that if you're presented with one, then you'll have some arguments to challenge it. So some of the things that we've mentioned to look out for are who commissioned it and why was it commissioned, who actually wrote it and why did they do that. To be very wary of numbers that are presented as objective, look where they came from, dig out the background calculations and see where they really came from. And also to question like what really is included, what costs, what benefits, and to who, to what groups. However, at the same time, although I think it's right not to be too intimidated by economic analysis and have the tools to challenge it, we also think that it's also important not to be too consumed by it. So it can be easy for a lot of attention to get suckered into doing reports where you do try and value things, or where you spend a lot of time going down economic arguments, which ultimately might not be the best ones to appeal to politicians who are influenced by lots of other things. So I think that's kind of one of the things to think about, is to not be dragged into all the time to economic arguments when there might be a better way of challenging a decision.
Excellent. So we've now got 10 minutes for questions. There's 3 that have already been sent. If anybody has any other questions about any of this, please just type it into the chat box. I'm sure that most of you have figured out how it works. But in the meantime, I'm going to put Susie on the spot and ask her, mainly because I don't actually know the answer to the last one. First of all, the first question was about where political economists fit into this kind of discussion. So I was wondering, I mean, when we talk about the political economy, we obviously talk about, well, it's much, much wider than just one kind of branch of economics. It's how people's behavior and politics and, well, I suppose, yeah, history as well all comes into play, and how the world is currently structured. Do you think they see themselves as a separate group of people?
I don't know too much. I mean, I think it can mean lots of different things. So when I've met, political economists might be people who are using very similar frameworks. They might be theoretical. They might be looking at the building theoretical models of why governments and politicians do things. They also might be using data. So I've seen like very good political theory around corruption and how money gets spent, those sort of things. But they might also be, I think there's also I initially thought this was referring to people who might be politicians or people like George Osborne, who is politically, I suppose, an economist, but at the same time it's questionable where the line between politics and economics really is. And I think that's a really important thing to question.
That actually leads on to a good point about this kind of, is economics a science in that sense? Is it the same as physics or something else that fits natural laws, or is a lot of what we're sort of being confronted with at the moment actually a political choice? And I think the bank bailout, for example, is a great example of a political decision that is now being spun as that had to happen, and therefore now we're going to have to make all of these public spending cuts. But in reality, that is down to the government. That's not some kind of natural, unchangeable physical law. It's pure politics. We had another good question, and this is definitely one for Susie, because this is from the world of SRI. So it was a question from Owen Gibbons saying, can you explain whether, and if so how, social return on investment can be used as a proxy for non-financial value? You did kind of answer part of that.
Yeah, I mean, actually I think that's probably a good question. Also, another thing I haven't covered so far is the difference between what we might call traditional cost-benefit analysis and new techniques like social return on investment, which on the one hand are trying to challenge and change the way cost-benefit is done, but they are still using some of the same techniques. So I think the main difference between those two things, cost-benefit and social return on investment, which will be covered in much more detail in later briefings, is that social return on investment takes a sort of stakeholder view of costs and benefits. So it tries to explicitly look at all the people that are affected by a particular policy or decision, not just the ones that might come to the mind of people that are making decisions. So, so the example I gave before was about Runway 3. We found that the Department for Transport had kind of looked at business growth, business interests, whereas the NEF approach was to look at the environment more, look at the people that were affected in the local environment as well, and also importantly to ask people how they'd be affected. So there were quite a lot of assumptions in the Department for Transport model about businesses benefiting from more airport travel, whereas when we spoke to businesses, and in fact it was the Kingfisher Group that wrote the forward for the report, they actually said, actually, we don't want to be travelling more. We want to make more use of things like video conferencing and new technology to avoid having to travel. So it's also a question about being clear what the real benefits and costs to stakeholders are. The question about proxies applies really to both techniques. So in cost-benefit analysis, the Treasury makes it really clear that you should be looking at all costs, even if they don't have a market price. So cost-benefit should in general be using proxies and be trying to include on the balance sheet things that not just things that have a market price. In practice, you do see things like the environment completely missed off, future generations already given a disadvantage because of the discount rate. So there, I'm not sure that's a big difference between SROI and cost benefit in theory. Although if you look at how SROI is done, you will generally see much more attention paid to social and environmental values.
And there's one more question. You're going to hate me for this.
Yeah, I see that question.
Jade's question: why do they not use multivariate statistics or Bayesian methods for assessing probability? I guess, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat box, Jade, but are you referring to the kind of the side of risk and uncertainty? Is that what you meant?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is again the difference between theory and practice. So if you look at academic economic papers, they absolutely use those sort of techniques. There's a lot of things around probability interactions. The whole field of game theory is about understanding how people interact under uncertainty. But when I've looked at cost-benefit analysis in the field or to justify political decisions, they seem to be treated rather poorly. So I think this is kind of one of the things that we're thinking about. And as well, although I actually think the point you just was more in the chat window about rather than linear methods. And this, I think, is a real challenge to economics. So there is often a focus or a lack of inclusion of models around, say, system dynamics or feedback loops, which are more commonly used in natural sciences. And I think this is where economics is beginning to take some strides towards that. But in general, it's often not used as much as they should be. And maybe this is where there'll be a real challenge to the field.
Great. Are there any more questions from anyone? Is everybody happy with that? Have they followed the discussions? No, it doesn't appear, unless you're... I'll give you a couple of minutes because you might be typing a very long question. Right, Ariana, yes. If you'd like to type your questions into the chat window, we can go through them there. People are just saying yes now.
Which meant they're really happy or really unhappy.
Okay. Aha. Okay. Here we go. No. All right. Have you answered this? Can you explain whether? Yeah. Answered that one. Sorry, Ariana and Amy and Ali. Does you writing yes mean you have more questions, or yes, you're happy? I'm just giving you the other option. Yeah. No questions, you're happy. Great.
Great.
Excellent. Okay. I'm happy. Yeah. I'm happy. Okay.
Yeah, more.
Sorry, no questions. Yes, I'm happy. Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. If you do have any questions or feedback, just drop me an email. Obviously, there's going to be the opportunity for some of your colleagues to watch the recording of this. And also, we're going to be running this every 2 weeks to go through all of the briefings. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments about this, about the briefings, or about the case studies, just email me at any point, and we'll be happy to get back to you with it. So until next time, have a good evening.